Going to mute everyone. We're in Tractate Sukkah. We're on page 20b, Chaf Amud Beis, and the new chapter, chapter 2. Chapter 2 begins with talking about the mitzvah of sleeping in the sukkah. And sleeping in the sukkah is, of course, one of the main activities that's supposed to be done in the sukkah: eating, drinking, and sleeping. Now, of course, we know that today's day and age, a lot of people rely on leniency of not to sleep in the sukkah. It's cold, it's dangerous, it's uncomfortable, mosquitoes and all different types of hetedrim, because you have leniencies of dwelling in the sukkah if it's not as comfortable as your house. Meaning that if your house, not just it's not as comfortable, I take that back. If you would be in your house, and in your house would be this uncomfortable, you would leave. So the same thing would be in a sukkah. You would be permitted to leave if you would have the same type of issues. And therefore, many people are lenient about not sleeping in the sukkah. However, the official law is that we are supposed to sleep in the sukkah, and many people are Meiser Nefesh even to sleep in the sukkah, and they even get air conditioners or heaters depending on what state you're in or where you live. But people bend over backwards to make it comfortable to be able to sleep in the sukkah. And here our Mishnah talks about the mitzvah of sleeping in the sukkah and tells us that you have to be careful when you sleep in the sukkah that you're not sleeping in a additional tent that's inside your sukkah, which means that you could be inside your sukkah, but not really be inside your sukkah. Why? So the case in the Mishnah is, what happens if you sleep under the bed in your sukkah? If you sleep under the bed in your sukkah, so the Mishnah starts off saying he has not fulfilled his obligation. Now, one of the things that this brings to mind is the fact that there's many people that want to sleep in the sukkah. They have a big family. So one of the questions would be, would you be allowed to have a bunk bed in the sukkah? And the bunk bed in the sukkah seemingly would be similar to this idea, because you're basically sleeping under another bed. So there's a bed on top, and then you're sleeping under it. And the issue that the Mishnah deals with is, are you really sleeping in the sukkah, or are you sleeping in a tent? And it's not called that you're in the sukkah. You're officially in a tent. You're in another tent. So there's of course discussion among the poskim about a bunk bed, but that is something that among those that are extra careful to sleep in the sukkah, is definitely something that's important to look into. Is it allowed? Are you allowed to sleep in a bunk bed, because you're sort of sleeping in a tent that's not exactly in the sukkah, or at least there's discussion about it. Again, the poskim do debate about it. It's a big topic. Yes, David.
When you say sleeping under a bed, besides the example of a bunk bed, does it mean sleeping under a mattress, like you got the mattress on top of you?
Well, that's not the simple understanding, I don't think. I think what it means is that, let's say you don't own a bunk bed, and you simply don't have enough space for everyone. So one person sleeps on the bed, and the good thing is the bed is elevated, and so another guy could sleep under the bed. In other words, it's there the you have the poles, and then there's the mattress on top of some type of planks of wood, maybe holding up the mattress. But under those planks of wood, there's a space. You have, the bed is elevated. People like to sleep elevated, so there's not enough space, so someone's gonna sleep under it and try to fulfill his obligation. And the Mishnah here tells us, at least the first opinion, is going to tell us that he has not fulfilled his obligation. So now we're going to, yes, Ezra.
Suppose you're sleeping in a sleeping bag, and it gets so cold that you end up pulling the sleeping bag over you.
Yeah.
Would that meet the same requirements as sleeping under a bed?
So that's a good question. It's almost like people wear clothing. Are you under your clothing, or are you under? It's of course you have to ask the question, but definitely that's not an issue to have a blanket, to have a sleeping bag on top of you, to have that's not considered that you're sleeping inside some other type of entity. It's sort of those type of entities are nullified to you. But here you have a bed that you're sleeping under. That could be considered like you're inside a tent, or you're under another sukkah.
But if you're sleeping, let's say in New York, where it's like 40 or 30 degrees outside, and you
5 blankets,
this
right?
thing over your head, isn't that like it's not buttle to you? It's actually keeping you warm to the extent that you are in a shell.
So I didn't hear exactly the word. There was 2 words that you said that I didn't really hear. You said if you're in New York, it's 40 degrees, and where are you sleeping that you're having?
You're sleeping inside the sleeping bag, and you're pulling the bag over your head in order to keep the heat
warm.
So it's like you're sleeping inside a shell.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's not a problem. It's still nullified to you. It's almost like you're in a swimsuit, or you're in a full body gear. That's not definitely not an issue. It's clothing. It's a blanket. That's not an issue. It's not considered a separate entity than the sukkah. You could even have 5 blankets or 10 blankets on top of you, and it would not be a problem. The issue here is that this is like a structure, an entity. You're inside. It has a halachic law of a tent, maybe. Then of course the Gemara is going to discuss that, how big it is. There's so how much space there is, I should say, between that and the floor. So that is where you get into this problem of a separate entity than the sukkah. But if it's blankets, if it's clothing, these are not issues. Even if you put it over your head and you cover yourself, and it's not considered that you're in a separate tent. Okay, so let's start the Mishnah. Again, we're on page 20b, and we're at the new chapter. So there's a big empty space in the Gemara. We're starting at the new paragraph in the Gemara. It's a new chapter, and if you want to know, it must be about 20 lines from the bottom of the page. Hayashen tachas hamita. He who sleeps under the bed, the sukkah, inside the sukkah. Lo yatsa yedei chayvasa. He has not fulfilled his obligation. And sleeping, as I mentioned, is a mitzvah, one of the main ways of dwelling in the sukkah, to the extent that eating, there are leniencies for eating. If you're eating temporary, some snack, no, you don't have to eat in a sukkah. Sleeping, even temporary, you're obligated to sleep in a sukkah. So a person who slept under the bed in the sukkah did not fulfill his obligation. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, Noyagin hayinu shahayinu yeshena tachas amita ifnei hazakenim. Now, Rabbi Yehuda says we would sleep under the bed in front of the elders. V'lo amru lanu davar, and they did not say anything to us. We would sleep. That's the way we would sleep in the sukkah. And it seemingly, why would they do that? the understanding I have is probably because of space. They had small sukkahs, not that they didn't have large areas that they could have built on, but the bigger your sukkah is, the stronger the sukkah has to be made, the more complicated it is. And they probably had small sukkahs. And so some of the people would sleep under the beds, and the rabbis didn't say anything. So Rabbi Yehuda says, I see from there as a proof that it was fine, that we were allowed to sleep under a bed in a sukkah. So we have the first opinion of the Mishnah that it's not allowed, you're not fulfilling your obligation. And we have the second opinion, Rabbi Yehuda, who says this is what we used to do. We would sleep under the bed in front of the elders, and they didn't tell us anything. Amar Rebbe Shimon. Reb Shimon says, Maisa b'tevi avdoi shel b'tevi, a story with Tevi. Avdoi shel Rabban Gamliel, the slave of Rabban Gamliel. Shahaya Yoshein Tachas Hamita, he would sleep under the bed, and the Mishnah continues and says, "Va'amar lehen Rabban Gamliel is a Canaan, and Rabban Gamliel told to the elders, Re'isem Tevi Avdi, did you see Tevi, my servant, Shehu Talmud Chacham? He is a scholar. V'yadeya she'av godim beturim nasukkah, and he knows that servants are exempt from a sukkah. Lefichach, therefore, Yoshenhu tachas hamita, he slept under the bed." So what is Reb Shimon saying? That the slave of Rabban Gamliel, Tevi, he was considered an Eved Kanani. He was considered a non-Jewish slave, so to speak. Now, what do I mean non-Jewish? He's in an in-between stage, because a servant, or a slave of called an Eved Kanani, he does a partial conversion. And that partial conversion makes him obligated to fulfill mitzvahs like a woman is obligated, meaning that he doesn't have to put tefillin on, he doesn't have to hear shofar, he doesn't have to sit in the sukkah, sleep in the sukkah, eat in the sukkah, he doesn't have to shake lulav and esrog. He's exempt from many of the mitzvahs that are time-bound. And just like women are exempt from time-bound mitzvahs, an Eved is exempt. Now, when an Eved is freed from his slavery, he then becomes a full-fledged Jewish man, and he becomes obligated in all the mitzvahs. But before that, while he's a slave, he's only obligated like a woman, and he's not really considered Jewish. He's an in-between stage where you can't really count it. You can't count him for a minyan, and he's not obligated in all the mitzvahs of Jewish men.
Rabbi,
and so
Rabbi,
he's a slave. He's exempt from sukkah. Yes, Moshe.
isn't an Abed Kanani even supposed to put on tefillin, even if he hasn't completely converted under certain circumstances, if he follows the Noahide laws?
I am not aware of that. There is a discussion here that Tosfos brings down that Yerushalmi, Tosfos brings on the second Tosfos in this chapter, Tosfos brings about Tevi, that he used to put tefillin on, and Rabbi Gamliel, the rabbis, they didn't protest. But the thing is that it doesn't tell us that they should. Tosfos mentions they didn't protest like it's allowed, but it's not. But Tosfos is thinking that, and Tosfos says that Yerushalmi asks a question. that here it seems like Rabban Gamliel didn't want him to sleep in the sukkah. He slept under the bed. And there it seems like it was fine that he put tefillin on. So it seems like it's not consistent. Rabbi Gamliel's opinion doesn't seem to be consistent. One place he seems to want him to put tefillin on. Another place he seems that he wants him to sleep under the bed. And that's Yerushalmi's question. The Yerushalmi answers that he slept under the bed because there wasn't enough room, and he didn't want to. There wasn't enough room for the rabbis, so he slept under the bed. And the Gemara, the Yerushalmi asks, well, why didn't he sleep outside the sukkah? And the Yerushalmi answers, well, he wanted to listen to the rabbi's discussion. So he would therefore slept under the bed in the sukkah. Instead of sleeping outside of the sukkah, he slept in the sukkah. But anyway, the bottom line is that he was allowed to wear tefillin, and he was allowed to sleep in the sukkah. And the reason he didn't sleep in the sukkah is there wasn't enough room. But
he had to keep Shabbos.
Did he have to keep Shabbos? Yeah, just like a woman has to keep Shabbos. Yeah, correct. So so the Mishnah says that we have the opinion of the Tanna Kama, the first opinion, that you can't sleep under a bed. We have Rabbi Yehuda's view that you're allowed to, and you can fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah by sleeping under a bed. And what did Reb Shimon say? What's Reb Shimon's conclusion? Reb Shimon says the story of Tevi, the servant of Rabbi Gamliel. What was the story there? That Rabbi Gamliel told the rabbis, see, he's knowledgeable. He's a scholar. He's a Talmud Chacham. He knows that he's exempt. And therefore, he slept under a bed. What do you see from there? So the Mishnah concludes and spells it out. According to according to our understanding, we learned. In other words, he didn't really say this to us as a law, but according to his the way he was joking, so to speak, or he was talking about this, we understood. We learned that someone who sleeps under the bed has not fulfilled his obligation of dwelling in a sukkah. So what comes out from here is we've got the only opinion that says you're allowed to sleep under a bed. Excuse me. The only opinion that says you're allowed to sleep under a bed is Rabbi Yehuda. Everyone else seems to hold that you're not allowed to sleep under a bed. And this, that Tevi slept under a bed, he was exempt, really. He's really exempt from sukkah, but he would, maybe he would have liked to sleep in the sukkah. You know, he would, just like women do mitzvahs even if they're not obligated to. And but nevertheless, he was exempt, and he slept under the bed. That the reason is because you're not fulfilling the mitzvah of dwelling in the sukkah, and therefore he slept under the bed and let the space of the other areas for other rabbis to sleep there. So that's the Mishnah. This is the first Mishnah in the second chapter. Now, I should mention that many people know of the Lubavitch minhag, so to speak, of not sleeping in a sukkah. Where does that come from? So the Lubavitch, it's not a minhag not to sleep. It doesn't seem like the proper term would be minhag. Lubavitch, there's a tradition, the Rebbeim in Russia, it was very surprising that they didn't sleep in the sukkah. Why was it surprising? In America, very few people sleep in the sukkah. But the thing was that these great rabbis, they were meiser nefesh to sleep in the sukkah, to do all the other mitzvahs. They would give their life up to do it. They refused to do anything that was that they were for sure allowed to. They were willing to give their life up in order not to transgress even what you would say smaller mitzvahs that you're not obligated to give your life up for. They would give their life up for. So the Rebbe asks a very strong question. He says, how is it possible that they weren't Meiser Nefesh to sleep in a sukkah? Sleeping in a sukkah would seem like obvious. Of course, they're going to sleep in the sukkah. And the Rebbe explained that there was actually the sukkah is a very spiritual entity. And in fact, Kabbalistic writings talks about how the sukkah comes is connected to the smoke that was created from the Anan HaKateiras in the Yom Kippur, the Holy of Holies. There was the cloud of smoke that came, and then the Holy of Holies, and that is where that cloud of smoke is what makes the sukkah. And so the sukkah has great revelations of godliness, and the more holy a person is, the more they're able to connect with these levels of spiritual levels, and therefore the Rebbeim would couldn't sleep when they were having such great revelations, and that was the understanding that the Rebbe had. The Rebbe said, therefore, many Chassidim also didn't sleep in the sukkah. Of course, they have the leniency of everyone else uses of not sleeping in the sukkah, but in addition to that, they also felt they didn't want to do more than their Rebbe does, or they didn't want to do different than their Rebbe does. And they wanted to feel connected to their Rebbeim, and therefore they wouldn't sleep in the sukkah. Of course, relying on the leniency of being mitzta'er, being in pain, and being in pain, just like everyone else is relying on this leniency. So they also would rely, so to speak, on this leniency, not in a sense of the typical meaning of being in pain, but being in pain that they're not gonna do the mitzvah differently than their rebbeim. So there, that's the logic behind the tradition that people are familiar with, that in Lubavitch they didn't sleep in the sukkah. But obviously the mitzvah of sleeping in the sukkah is of course, it's clear, very clear, as you see in our Mishnah. This is the fact that Rashi mentions Iker Yeshivas HaSukkah. The main dwelling in the sukkah is eating, drinking, and sleeping. Now the Rebbe had a very big chumrah. He didn't want to sleep in the sukkah. He couldn't sleep in the sukkah, but he couldn't sleep outside the sukkah. How could you sleep outside the sukkah? So the Rebbe wouldn't sleep the whole sukkah. How he did that, the Rebbe was in a different, sort of like an angel, not to sleep. As it was, he used to sleep 2 hours or whatever every night. So somehow he lasted through Sukkot without sleeping. I don't think it's advisable for anyone to try, but anyway, obviously, my point is that the mitzvah of sleeping in a sukkah is a very well-established mitzvah, and it's in Shulchan Aruch, and no one should think that it's there's any that it's like you don't have to. No, you really have to sleep in a sukkah, and we're relying on different reasons why people don't sleep in the sukkah is based on it's also based in Shulchan Aruch that there are leniencies, so to speak, not to sleep in a sukkah. And the way the Rebbe explained about the other Rebbeim that they didn't sleep in the sukkah, it had to do with the fact that they couldn't fall asleep there. It would be impossible to sleep there. So that was the understanding of why they didn't actually sleep in the sukkah. Now the Gemara now has a question that brings us back to an earlier Gemara that we talked about more than once. It came up maybe twice or three times, and that is when we learned about a sukkah that's under another sukkah. We said that, of course, you're not allowed to. You can't fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah in a sukkah that's under another sukkah. You have two sukkahs on top of each other. We said that you can't. The bottom sukkah is called a sukkah tachas sukkah. It's called a sukkah under another sukkah. You're not fulfilling the mitzvah. Now, how big does the top sukkah have to be for the bottom sukkah to be invalid? And so the same law would seemingly connect to this Gemara, to this Mishnah, because we're talking about your dwelling under a bed. How tall is that bed that it's considered like an oihel, that you're inside a new tent, like a new entity, and you're not really inside your sukkah. You're in a tent, and you're not in the sukkah. How big is a tent? How big does a tent have to be in order to be considered a tent? How big? What are the rules? So the Gemara says, when the Gemara asks it as a question, v'haleka asara. The Gemara asks, what's wrong with sleeping under a bed if it's not official? Inside your sukkah. If it's a tent, fine. If it's considered a schach, you're considered to be in some separate entity. Okay, fine. Then you're not in your sukkah. You're inside another tent. You're inside a different sukkah. That's not kosher. But here, the bed is not 10 tefachim. It's not 10 handbreadths tall. And so, like a typical bed, most beds are not 10 handbreadths tall from the ground. The area under the bed, so you have what, a foot? Maybe you have a foot space there. You have a bottom mattress, a top mattress. You have the two mattresses on top of each other, and then it's true. It's a little high up, but the space, the area of empty space, is not 10 handbreadths. 10 handbreadths is like 31.5 inches, according to the lower opinion. You don't have that type of space. So why is it called that you're inside you're under a bed, that you're like in a separate entity? So the Gemara answers, Tirguma Shmuel b'mita asaro. Shmuel explains it that you actually are you are dealing with a bed that actually does have 31.5 inches of empty space. And because there's 31.5 inches of empty space, therefore, it's considered like a separate entity. And being a separate entity, you're inside something else other than a sukkah. You're under a bed. You're in a bed structure. You're under the bed structure. So therefore, you have not fulfilled the mitzvah of dwelling in the sukkah. The Gemara continues, and it gets a little technical here and complicated with the laws of Oyhel, which is the laws of tents, and Tuma, impurity, Paraduma, the red heifer. So we're going to have to jump right into this. But before we do, I just want to mention, Taisvis brings up on the side, the first Taisus over here on the side of the page, Taisus brings up that, Shmuel's view was not the only view. There were other views when we learned that Gemara about how big is the sukkah above, how tall does the above sukkah need to be in order to invalidate a sukkah that's below it. And we had different opinions, 4 tefachim, 1 tefach, 4 handbreadths, which is handbreadth is around 3.15 inches, let's say 3 point something inches. So 4 handbreadths or 1 handbreadth. Shmuel said 10 handbreadths. Why does our Gemara just mentions the measurement of 10? And seems to be following Shmuel. So Taisva says that this Shmuel, he is following his view from the earlier chapter that we learned about the 10 handbreadth rule. But the other opinions, they would hold that if you have a small bed, a low bed, it would also be problematic. So what comes out from here is that even if you're in a typical bed, even if you have a typical bed that's quite low, and it doesn't have 10 handbreadths, 31.5 inches of empty space, you would still not be allowed to sleep under the bed. Why? Because you got other opinions, not just Shmuel. There's other views as well. According to those other views, there's different measurements. So the question, of course, would be who the halacha follows. But the point that Tosfos brings out is that this is not necessarily accepted by all of the views. This is just Shmuel's view, that he's continuing with his earlier view that he mentioned in that previous Gemara. But then Tosfos ends off and he says, possibly everyone agrees with this. What does that mean, that possibly everyone agrees with this? So Tosfos says, could be a bed is different. A bed is called a temporary tent. In this temporary tent, in order for it to really be called a tent, it needs to have a solid amount of space. 10 handbreadths is that measurement to make it more of a, solidify it as a tent. To consider it a real tent, could be that everyone will agree here. And I think the reason why Tosfos is saying that is because why does our Gemara only give Shmuel's view? What about the other views? Why doesn't the Gemara go into the other views as well? So could be that's what Tosfos is understanding from the Gemara, that here maybe everyone agrees. There was a discussion about a sukkah. You have a sukkah above and a sukkah below, and the question is, how big is it? Does it need to be the top sukkah in order to disqualify the sukkah below? And there it was considered a sukkah. It was considered an entity. It was a structure. So there you had different opinions. But here you're under a bed. The bed is not really an oil. It's not really a sukkah. It's really a bed. And you want to call it a separate entity, that needs to have maybe 10 tefachim. Maybe it needs to have 10 handbreadths in order to make it right, to consider it into this oil, tent, another entity. That it might need to have that measurement to give it that term of a sukkah. So that is Tosfos's two options. It could be that the other views will argue on this. The earlier views on, again, this is going back to an earlier discussion on page 10, where we had the topic of a sukkah tachas, a sukkah below another sukkah. It could be that the other views would follow their opinion, and according to that, we'd have to figure out who the halacha follows. And but it could be that there are different views. There's a view 10 handbreadths, could be a bed, could be would have another view of, it could be with that the other views would hold their opinions, which is 4 handbreadths or 1 handbreadth. But Tosfos says, but possibly everyone agrees here, because this is a bed that's considered an oyhel arai. It's considered a temporary tent that would possibly need, according to all opinions, to have 10 handbreadths. So that's the way Tosfos explains this Gemara, that it doesn't conclude really. He really leaves it up in the air, that it's possible that everyone agrees here. Now, the next Gemara, it is a Mishnah in Tractate Ahalos, tractate that talks about tents. And the Mishnah says as follows. Tanan Hasam, we learned over there. This is the Mishnah in Ahalos. Whether it's a hole that water caused to make this hole, and oishratzim, or little creatures. Rashi says like weasels, or bats. Or that the earth has like a salt or mineral parts that caused it to break apart. So you somehow have a hole for whatever reason. Either it's the water caused it to cause this hole, the shrutzim creatures, the malachas, which is some type of minerals or salt that cause this hole. Midbach avonim. The same thing would apply if you have stones that are set into like a wall, but there's empty space in between some of them. And so you have two on the bottom and one on top. And let's say there's a space in between the two on the bottom. So v'chein soyer shel koiros, and the same thing would be a pile of beams, wooden beams. Same idea, that you could have on the bottom a hole, an empty space, and you could have on top of it, you could have something solid. What is that called? An oyhel, a tent. What do the laws of tent apply to? The laws of tent apply to the laws of tumah, impurity. If there's a dead body under one part of this tent, and then there's some other item or person, utensil under the other side, another area of the tent. So the tent, it brings the impurity and it takes it to the entire tent. And so anything under that tent will be impure. Now, these laws don't apply so much today's day and age. They apply a little because a kohen has to be careful not to become tameh. But they don't apply so much like it did apply in the olden days. In the olden days, in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, they had to be much more careful for purity and impurity. And because people would bring korbanos, there was truma, they were separating truma, giving it to the kohen, meiser, all different types of holy things. There was all different types of korbanos that they were eating, and therefore they had to make sure they're going to the Beis Hamikdash also for the to be oila regel. They had to make sure that they're not tamei, they're not impure. Bring the korban pesach, they had to bring the korbanos we learned chagiga, the oilas re'iyah, all different types of sacrifices that they would bring. And they needed to worry about the laws of tumah, especially the laws of tumas meis. Tumas meis was extra strict. What is extra strict about the laws of tumas meis, of laws of a dead body? Number one, it's 7 days of impurity. So quite a strong tumah. Number two, you need to be sprinkled with the hara aduma, the red heifer. The red heifer the ashes of the red heifer was mixed with water. It's called the mei chatos. So there's a lot of laws about these olis. Now, people normally shut down when we learn the laws of tum and tahara. And I think that mainly because we're not so familiar with it. We're not so, it's not so practical to us. But anyway, we're going to try to get through this. So you have these cases where you have what's called an oyhel, a tent. What do I mean a tent? There's an empty space. You have some type of an entity with some empty space, a wall that has an empty space. You have beams that are piled on top of each other, and there's an empty space. You have somehow you have some type of an entity. You have earth that has empty space because water made a hole, or animals. Anyway, bottom line is that this could be considered a tent that could bring impurity from one end of the tent to the other end of the tent. If there's a dead body under one end, so the stuff under the other end of the tent, or in the middle of the tent, or next to it, will be impure because they're under the same tent. So it says, Ma hilala tumah. These things are considered oyels. They considered a tent on top of the impurity. Rabbi Yehuda says, Kol oyel she'eino yosi b'dei adam eino oyel. Rabbi Yehuda says any tent that's not made by man, and Rashi adds in over here that it's not made with the intent that it should be a tent. In other words, even if it was made by a person, but he didn't have in mind that it's meant for a tent. He meant to build a bed, he meant to build something else. So if you didn't have in mind, then it's not considered a tent. And if it's not made by a person, it didn't have intention, then it's not a real, that's not a tent. And what's the reason? My time of Rabbi Yehuda. What's the reason of Rabbi Yehuda? So the Gemara says, and now we turn the page to 21a. Yalef oyel mi mishkan. We learn the oyel gezeira shabbat. There's a word oyel that it says by the Mishkan, and we learn oyel that it says by the laws of Tumah, impurity. And so we compare the two laws. Ksiv hacha zeis haTorah adam ki yamas bayil. It says here, and here means the laws of impurity, the laws of tent, purity of a dead body. It says this is the Torah, this is the law. Adam, a person, ki yamas bayil, if he dies inside a tent, then the other things that are in the tent are going to be impure. Uksiv hasam, and it says over there regarding the Mishkan, the tabernacle, it also says the word tent. But Yivrei says oyel ala Mishkan. They spread out the oyel over the Mishkan. And when it talks about spreading out the oyel on top of the Mishkan, it means that there was the covering on top of the Mishkan, and they spread it out. So mal lahalon bidei adam, just like over there, it's talking about in the hands of man, that it was made by a man, those human action. It was done with intention, and by human beings. So here also, the Gemara says, the Rabbi Yehuda, at least I should say, Rabbi Yehuda says, you see that here also, Afkan bidei adam, here also it's only considered an oyel that's going to cause impurity. It's only called a tent that's going to cause impurity, as if it's bidei adam with intention, going to be done by man. Now, of course, the famous question that the Mishkan was made by Hashem. It stood up by a miracle. So was it done by human
by froze? But Moshe is the one who vayifros says, oh hell.
Yeah, but the only thing is the Medrash says that it stood up. And really, Moshe couldn't stand it. It stood up on its own. So the commentaries mention this question.
The boards stood up, but
Moshe
put the.
So as Jeffrey tells us, the one way of answering that Medrash is that the boards maybe stood up on their own, and but the actual spreading out was done by man. Anyway, bottom line is that Rabbi Yehuda holds that a tent that's not made with the intention of being a tent, that would not be considered an oyel for tumah, for impurity. Now, the other opinion, the rabbis, the common view, the first opinion, is that it is considered a tent. All these other cases where animals did it, the water made this hole, it made a tent. The shrutzim, which we said was like the weasel or the bats, somehow the different ways of that it came about. This tent, it wasn't done intentionally. Someone was building a wall, and there was an empty space in the wall. It's a tent. The first opinion says that's considered a tent. Rabbi Yehuda says no. We learn from the oyel, from the Mishkan, that a tent has to be made intentionally. So the Gemara says, Rabbanan, what do the rabbis do? Don't they have this Gzeira Shavah that they should learn from the fact that this Mishkan, it says tent, should teach us that it has to be done intentionally? The Gemara answers, oyel riba. Many times it says the word oyel in this parsha, in this portion that it talks about the red heifer. And because it says it many times, we use the extra time to teach us that it includes even a tent that is made on its own is also considered a tent that's going to spread. It's considered a tent that it could spread impurity. That's the lesson that the rabbis understand, that it's from the extra times that it says oyel to teach you that even if it's not intentional, it's still going to spread impurity. Now, if we think about it, and one of the things you have to always do is go back and try to think over the Mishnah. and see how it flows. So the Mishnah mentioned Rabbi Yehuda's view. What was Rabbi Yehuda's view? That you're allowed to sleep in a bed, under a bed, in a sukkah. So what is, according to this Mishnah, do we have a little understanding of Rabbi Yehuda? We just learned the Mishnah in Ahalos, and the Mishnah here says that a tent that's not made with the intention of being a tent is not really a tent. It's not meant to protect things under it. It's not built for that purpose. That's not a tent. So this maybe could be a little understanding, at least at this point. Now, we're not going to conclude with this, but at least we have a little understanding maybe of Rabbi Yehuda now based on this Mishnah. At least as an initial understanding. We were a little stuck when we learned the Mishnah. Somehow Rabbi Yehuda says you're allowed to sleep under a bed. The other opinions, the Tanakama, the first opinion, and Reb Shimon, they all said, no, chas v'shalom, you can't sleep under a bed. It's a tent. It's not. What. So here we have a little understanding, maybe, at least at this point, that Rabbi Yehuda, he has a gzeira shava. He has a way of learning one word, from another word. Two different laws compare on each other, that they teach each other certain lessons. And one of the lessons that we learn here is that if a tent is not made with intention, it's not really a tent. So maybe that would be a reason why you could sleep under a bed, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Just at least as an initial understanding. Now we're going to prove that wrong and so on, but at least at this point that we sort of see that in this Mishnah in Ahalos. Okay, now comes the next Gemara.
Very interesting next section. This is very interesting. I remember from an earlier time. Because the Tuma of Kohanim is a big issue also, right, that you brought up. And this is one of the solutions to this problem that we're all Tameim. So how do you accomplish it that you have anybody who's not Tamei?
Right. Yeah, I don't really know. What do you suggest? How do you?
Well, they're going to tell you this story that I remember reading
right.
First time I studied Sukkah.
Yes.
Right?
This story is brought in a number of places, correct? But yeah. But anyway, okay. We'll soon see. Yes.
He said, "Go ahead, Rabbi, teach it."
Okay, let's go. So the Gemara asks, "The Savar Rabbi Yehuda kol oyel she'ena yosef b'di'adam ein oyel." Does Rabbi Yehuda really hold that a tent that's not made intentionally by man is not a tent? V'raminu, and we have a contradiction to this point. We have a clear Mishnah that or Brisa that's not so. What does it say? So this is from Para. I believe, yeah, it must be a Mishnah, Para. So it says over there, Chatzeros hayu benuyos b'Yerushalayim. There were courtyards built in Yerushalayim al gabe hasela, on top of bedrock, v'tachteim cholol, and under them was empty space, mipnei kever hatohim, because of the kever of, because of a potential grave that we are not sure about. Tahoim means of something hidden, meaning that it's a suffix. It's unclear. We don't know if there was ever someone buried there. So we use the term kever hatahoim. It's tahim means the depths, which we don't know. We're not sure. We don't know if there was ever anyone there. So we want to prepare the Efer Hapara, the mechatos, the water, the ashes of the para that's mixed with water. It's called mei nida or mechatos. This water that's going to be sprinkled, we want to make sure to prepare it with the greatest level of purity. And so there were courtyards built in Yerushalayim that they made sure that these are like right. They built them on top of the bedrock, and they made space under them, which means that they would build like domes in a way that there would be different layers of a oihel, so that in all areas, even if there was some grave all the way down under the ground, the grave tuma, the impurity of that grave, of that dead body, would stop, because there's an oihel, there's an empty space that would block it from going upward. And it would be trapped, the impurity, the spiritual impurity would be trapped under that dome, under that tent, so to speak. So they built these arches, I guess that would be a better word, arches. They built arches, and that's how they made these courtyards on top of these arches that was on top of the bedrock. And there was empty space under them because of a kever hatahoim, an unsure grave, because of an unknown grave. Umavia nash now. Umavia nashim ubrais, and they would bring pregnant women, the yoldais sham, and they would give birth in this area. In other words, on this, let's say they had this, I don't know, mile by a mile or half a mile by a half a mile area where they built this area for women would give birth there. And pregnant women that were ready to give birth, they would go there. And these are women who wanted their children to be involved in preparing the red heifer ashes, the paraduma. So what would they do? They would give birth there. And they would bring their children up over there. They would never leave that place. The children would stay in that area. And they must have had a good playground or whatever, and maybe a good preschool and good teachers. And they would stay there. They would never leave that area until they were 9 years old. You know, and they would bring their children, their boys, up over there to use that, that they should be involved leparot, in order to serve, in order to prepare the paraduma mavian shvarim. And then what would they do when it was time to make a paraduma? They would bring a oxen, val gabehen delosais, and on top of their backs there was doors. In other words, they would place a door flat on the back of an ox. V'tinoikos yoshvin al gabehen, and the babies, the children would, doesn't mean babies, the
Babies
children
anymore.
can't be
Yeah.
babies. They were children. They would sit on the backs of these oxen. The kaisa shall even be dayan, and they would have these stone cups in their hands. Higiu l'shiloyach, and they would reach the water source, which was the shiloyach spring, and they would reach there. Yardu, they would go down l'saychamayim into the water, umilum, and they would fill up these stone cups, va'alu, and then they would go back up, the yashvu lahem, and sit back down on top of the oxen and bring it back, and they would basically have the water mayim chayim that they would need for this for the red heifer ashes. Now, in Rabbi Yossi, I remember Rabbi Yossi says actually they wouldn't go down; they would lower a rope from sitting on top of the oxen. They would lower a rope, umamale, and fill up this stone vessel with a rope, and this is all mebnei kever atahoim, because they were nervous that there might be a grave that's unknown, and therefore they would do all of this procedure. Now, what is the meaning of all this? The meaning is,
Rabbi, question.
Yes, yeah.
We're saying that the animals do not convey tumah.
well, they're alive. while it's alive.
Okay. Secondly, the kids themselves are sitting on top, and they themselves would not convey tumah either.
They don't receive tumah. They shouldn't be tumah.
Right.
No, the goal is that they never went anywhere else. They've been living on this area for the last 7 years or 6 years or 8 years. Once they reach the age of 9, we are nervous that they might have had a wet dream, Kerry, or they might have had some seminal emission, and therefore they would be no longer eligible to be part of this group of these, but until that age, until the age of 9, they would be allowed to be part of this group that would hang out there. And I guess they had special school there and preschool and who knows what. And then that's where they would hang out. Now, Tosfos asks a very strong question, which I think is probably bothering you, Ezra, and maybe other people. And that is, I mean, the fact is that, the mother was nursing the baby. And what about, all the other, there are obviously, other potential scenarios where there's impurity of, first of all, the mother gave birth to this child. The mother is tumas yoledus. She's tamei when she gives birth, as it says in the Chumash in Parshas Tazria, shloshim yot, that the 7 days or 14 days, and there's the days of impurity, and of course, all of these type of issues are not exactly. She's not exactly pure. She's totally. She's 100% impure. She's yoledus, and so how do you deal with all of these problems? And why do we think we're saving this situation? It's impossible that they're tummy. Oh yeah, it's impossible. I mean, there's all different types of tumas that they might have had, and it's true the child never had impurity. What about the mother? The mother, and so. What about the person? Tosfos asks even stronger. Tosfos asks, what about the person who's actually mixing it? He's doing the kohen who does the mixing of the water. You're just getting me the water. But what about the kohen who actually is going to do the sprinkling, and he's gonna actually do the sprinkling, or he's going to do the mixing? So that kohen, he's not being brought up on this in this area, and he's an older man. He's of course over bar mitzvah, so he already has potential that he's Kerry and Zav and all the other types of tumas mace. He could have definitely been in contact with a dead body at some point in his life. So Tosfos asks, well, what's all this helping? So Tosfos answers that whatever we can try to fix, we try to fix. We do as much as we can. So in other words, this is not saying that there's no way that there was ever any issue of impurity. That's not what we're saying. We're doing as much as we can. Now, why are we going bending over backwards and really making ourselves crazy to do this? And obviously, it must not have been that easy. Sir, you needed to find exceptional people who wanted to spend the next 7-8 years hanging out with their children up there in this in this area that they were going to use. They're going to have their child be involved in the paraduma. So the thing is that the law of paraduma, the law of the red heifer, had a very big leniency. Because it had a leniency, therefore we wanted to be extra strict on everything else. The leniency about the paraduma was that the paraduma, the red heifer, was allowed to be, you were allowed to be a Tavul Yoim, someone who was Tameh that day, and you went to the mikveh that day, you're immediately allowed to work with the paraduma to do the sprinkling and so on, even if it didn't get dark yet. normally a lot of tumas, you need to wait to eat truma. You need to wait herav shemesh till it gets dark, till the sun goes down. Here, Parah Aduma has a special law that even before it gets dark, you're already allowed to to be involved in working with the Parah Aduma, because it had such a strong leniency, and the tzedukim didn't agree with this leniency. So we went out of our way to fulfill this leniency. We would make the person who's going to be sprinkling it, we would make him tameh, make him impure. The person who was mixing it, we would make him impure, and then he would go to mikvah, and then he would all of a sudden start dealing with the Parah Aduma. So because we would go to the other extreme of leniency, because we wanted to show that tzedukim are wrong, we wanted to show that these those that only believed in the written Torah didn't believe in the oral Torah, want to prove that they were wrong. We went out of our way to be lenient. So therefore, we also went out of our way to be extra strict and everything else that we could. And we made sure that the Parah Aduma was done with complete purity and so on. And we haven't really come to the main point, but that is the story. At least you have the story. We're going to stop here, and Metz Hashem to be continued tomorrow.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Isn't
Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you,